And everyone, welcome back once again to the adventures of the Monk and the Monarch. With me, the Monarch, and as always, my co-host, Mildra the Monk.
Hello.
Now today should be a fun one because we're talking another old school anime director who a lot of you have probably heard the name, Masami Obari.
And if you haven't heard the name, I guarantee you this. You have seen one particular shot everybody has done that I guarantee whether you're a newbie or an old hat with anime, you have seen this shot. Because all hail the Obari pose. I know some people are trying to call it brave perspective. If I'm being honest, it is going to be the Obari pose.
Yeah.
It has been the Obari pose for years. That is the name that has stuck. There is nothing you can do to change that.
You've probably also seen the Obari punch.
Yeah. For those who may be living under a rock and are not named Sun Wukong, the Obari pose, I guess I could say diagonal focused sword pose. While this was used a lot in Mecha and is still used a lot in Mecha, it has since surpassed that to the point where this thing is every. I cannot understate enough how wide encompassing the Obari pose is. There are whole collages of like hundreds of anime that just have that shot.
The funny thing, I've read interviews with Obari on it. He's only half responsible for it. I forget who is one of his animators was he was working with at the time, but it came about because of the way Obari would kind of cut frames from animation and just kind of do a lot of snapshots. It kind of snapped right into that pose very well, so it was an effort between two different people that made it. This is going to be a little interesting compared to other director dives we've done, because in a lot of ways, Obari's legacy isn't really him as a director at all. I'm not saying he's a bad director by any stretch or that his works haven't had their impact, but this guy is known in huge part for his designs and a lot of animation tricks he ended up creating over the years.
I'd say he's one of the people who's, if there's any big part of his legacy, it is helping carry on the legacy of the super robot genre, and if anything, making sure that it didn't fall by the wayside. I've talked in the past about how there's this narrative that mecha anime was a glorified toy commercial until Mobile Suit Gundam came along in the 70s. In the late 70s, let me clarify, which does not match reality. If anything, it's not like the super robot genre just ended when Gundam came along. Plus, for the longest time, a lot of those things that are considered glorified toy commercials, for a good amount of time, it stopped being that. Tokusatsu has been more the toy commercial. If anything, anime has been a glorified music commercial.
Yeah.
because the bigger bankroll, and we've talked about this, has been through music companies. I'd say to a certain extent, model kit companies. I mean, everybody knows how much of a dominating force Gunpla is. It mostly had to do with the fact that back in the 70s, Tokusatsu started stealing the thunder of anime. I know it makes a good story to say that Mobile Suit Gundam was the savior of a whole genre, but just because Dusty Rhodes said "Don't let the truth get in the way of a good story" doesn't apply here. If you're going to be talking about history, you better know your history. As I said last night, and anyone who thinks that they've seen everything hasn't seen anything.
Yes. I will say, though, getting this back onto Obari, it's a little frustrating piecing together everything from those first few years, because not everywhere just seems to have collected all the relevant stuff. You have Wikipedia, which just shows his directing and designs. Then you have some sites that may leave out one of those and just talk about where he was the animator. But he also isn't credited a lot of the times for being the animator of the openings of certain shows.
Truth be told, it's not uncommon for a whole other studio to handle an opening. Much like it's not uncommon
Yeah.
for whole separate studios to handle cutscenes in video games. Like Blur Studios does a lot of CG cutscenes for a bunch of different video games.
But like Metal Armor Dragonara is a rather important one that a lot of people might not really realize because again, that wasn't really a show that seems to have come out outside of Japan. I think that opening kind of encompasses a lot of what you would come to see from Obari. Well, in part because of how many people apparently have cited that opening as just being like one of the greatest at the time. I did watch it. It is a fantastic opening. Like a lot of this you have to find through like digging up old interviews with him.
I'd say one of the things that he's certainly has certainly been one of his biggest contributions is a certain design of mech, especially when it comes to the face. And if you want an ultimate case of people carrying on that concept, I will refer to SSSS Gridman, which even he brought up that it was very much channeling his work.
That said, in these days to say an mech anime is to some degree channeling Obari's work seems redundant. Because it's everywhere. Here's a thing that came up in some of those interviews I've been reading from him. You're going to have a robot, it's going to have like a static face. That wasn't new by the time even Obari had started doing designs. You'd see robots with the faces. But he'd start designing them and doing like heavy shading, so even though the face is static, you're seeing like a lot of expression changes in the robot's face. Just through use of like heavy shading. You also see it in how he like designs the arms and legs of his to where they look like they have a lot of tension in them, even though, well, they're robots, they technically shouldn't. He did a lot to change how people would design mechs going forward.
He got his start back in the mid-'80s under Aishi Production. One of the first things that he did was Special Armored Battalion Dorvac, which I think I saw like one episode of, so I can't comment too much on it. And of course, he was part of the umbrella of doing animation with Transformers. Though his involvement with Transformers was more of a outsourcing thing. Yeah. Like how Production IG will outsource in between animations. And then Star Musketeer Bismarck, which is amusing because Bismarck was a Studio Pierrot project. Back in the day, Studio Pierrot was mostly known for adapting Shonen Jump anime, or adapting Shonen Jump manga into anime. Even up through the 2000s, they were still doing that. The big break was Dankuga.
Now, I do want to note a bit more about Bismarck, because at the time, he was originally starting doing just key animations. That's where, partway through that series, he'd actually started doing the key animations and not just in between, which, mind you, he's 19 at this point in his life.
Yeah.
For a 19-year-old to already have started doing key animations, that's not normal.
Of course, after that was the Bubblegum Crisis OVA series. He did episodes 5 and 6 of that,
which was his directorial debut.
You know how we said that even though Macross Plus was Watanabe's directorial debut, it's not his full coming out party because it is still someone else's vision?
Yeah, Watanabe himself said he probably shouldn't have been credited as the main director. Assistant was probably the better term.
I don't think Obari has said anything like that when it comes to Bubblegum Crisis.
Yeah, that's it. Remember, he was the episode director, not like the head director, so I don't think he really needed to say anything.
If there's anything that was the real coming out party for him, I'd honestly say it was the Fatal Fury OVAs. Which, those OVAs are still end up getting referenced to this day.
I believe he only directed the motion picture, didn't he? But he did a lot of designs for the others.
He's primarily credited with the character design, because keep in mind originally there was the TV special, then another one, and then the movie, and later all three of them were collected together. But I would say the look of those designs is what has been referenced for decades since. And right in the middle of that, he ends up forming Studio G1.
Okay, if you look at the catalog that G1 worked on, it is so weird. It is Mecha, Magical Girl, and an erotic show called The Hills Have Size. For some reason in the middle of all of that.
I wonder if they just did it just to say that they had done it.
I don't think Obari worked on that one himself specifically, but the studio he founded did.
And it is important to note that it was that at one point it was disbanded and then reformed under Studio G1 Neo. It's kind of like how back in the days Proto Promotions 01 folded, and then immediately afterwards a new promotion called 01 Max shows up.
You gotta wonder if there's some kind of a tax thing going on there.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
Especially since it feels like the sole reason that that 01 was even made was in part because of politics. Like, Japanese pro wrestling can get very political, but not in the way a lot of people think of political these days. More in a knives in the dark kind of thing. It was mainly a vehicle for Shinya Hashimoto because the company he was at decided to run him out of town. So he was like, screw you, I'll make my own company. And kind of opened Pandora's box for a lot of old legends to try and make their own indie company, which would reach its nadir in the 2000s with World Japan. I'm not going to go too far into that promotion because Kim Justice has already done a very good breakdown of the shit show that was. The point is that it disbanding and then reforming. There could be a myriad of reasons, and I'd imagine some reasons are stupider than others. One of the other things to note, and this is something I've talked about in the past, is you mentioned shading, and I really do think that if there's one concept in animation that is significantly underrated, it is the effect of shading in the overall presentation.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, like you could take a static face that you would see on a robot and through shading create all kinds of different expressions on it.
I lost the tweet, and this was a tweet that came across about a year ago. But somebody had taken shots from Ultimate Spider-Man and just added shading to it, and it ends up looking so much better. And it's not like they didn't do any redraw or anything like that. They just did a bit of color change to give the appearance of shading.
Yeah, one other thing I will note, it's kind of something I didn't notice again until I read through some of his old interviews. And that's kind of how you would set up a shot. Or like you would see what a lot of shows would do, especially back then. You know, they'd set up the scene, film it as they had it set. But one of the things Obari started to think about is when you actually are filming someone, whether or not they know they're on camera is going to change how they move. And that's how he started doing a lot of his own shots, is how you would see an actor act differently depending on where the camera is. It's weird to describe it, but when he pointed out that's how he started doing his shots, that's a big reason his stuff stood out amongst everybody else's. Is he just filmed them with a different mindset than anyone else was at the time.
Now, the funny thing is when it comes to director, he's definitely one of those people who you're going to see in the conversation when it comes to the OVA boom period in the 90s, which we talked about in an earlier episode of the Adventures. And some of the designs that he's contributed to have been mainstays in the Super Robot Wars series for years. Apparently, his director stuff goes as recent as 2020, doing the OVA for Gundam Build Divers Batlog. Yeah. And of course, Amime and Build Metaverse were two ONAs that he was involved with. He's very much still doing stuff.
Like, you don't see him too active as a director, really, but he continues to be just a mainstay designer.
doing opening scenes. He was responsible for doing the opening sequence for one of my fortunate or unfortunate guilty pleasures, Vice Kreutz.
He actually said that's why he wanted to get into the industry in general, is he loved the premise of making that opening with the limited cuts and getting so much into such a small period of time. And I think that kind of reflects through his style in general. A lot in a very small period of time that is easy to follow.
A lot of animation is trying to get the most from the least, especially where it concerns budget.
One thing I will note, he does, as he put it, prefer to like hand draw all of his stuff. He found that is apparently difficult on certain projects where he knows he's going to have to hand it off to somebody else. Because apparently he's been yelled at because no one could like recreate his stuff from just pure hand drawn. So he had to start using rulers if he was working on projects with other people.
That's not too surprising. Obviously, you can't have one person drawing everything on a project anymore. You haven't been able to do that and have it done on time in decades. Him needing a ruler, I look at that as a case of does he not use a style guide or anything?
Well, like he can recreate his own stuff, no problem. It's just when other people have to work with it, they couldn't do it. So he did it to make other people's lives easier.
Yeah, which makes me wonder if he had gotten yelled at around the time that animation was starting to shift over to DigiPaint, like in the early 2000s.
It's possible. I didn't see him comment on that directly. Apparently, when he tried to do like some 6-second frame cuts or six frame cuts, he got yelled at by the sound designer because like, look, I can't insert sound in that small of a space. It keeps bleeding over. So he's apparently been yelled at a few times for various reasons.
I do think that it's gotten to the point where that particular style he pioneered, I won't say standard, but one that a lot of people are drawing from.
You'll notice so far we haven't talked too much about like any individual show. Like we normally talk a little bit more about some of them. But I don't think like as a director he was the most varied and interesting in that regard. Again, he's certainly good. But everything he did is kind of overshadowed by the designs and animation. Like that's what he's going to be remembered for.
I'd say one of the other things is defining a lot of the look of things for a good amount of time. I'd say that's the difference between him and some of the other ones. He is definitely someone whose contributions are more on the visual, on the artistic side of things, rather than on the direction and storytelling. That's not to say he can't tell a story or something like that, but that's clearly where his passions end up laying. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point there was some art gallery presentation for him, the same way there was for Miura and plenty of other artists.
I'm going to say, like, if you want a good one to watch just to understand, like, how he does like to tell a story and where his emphasis is, it's the last project he released, Brave Bang Bravern.
Yeah.
It is kind of shown as a parody or marketed as such, but I think that's only half true. It's like Obari made himself a love letter to all the stuff he made in the past. What does he care about? The flash, the style, the passion. All the people in the show that are like the big wigs, the military type that are like at first trying to act like, you know, this is a real war and life or death situation going on, just get bludgeoned over the head with the fact they're in an anime until they all just kind of accept it. Like, you know what? Yeah, friendship and passion saves the day. Let's go. I think I once described it as like the very beginning when Bravern shows up. It's like if you're watching Saving Private Ryan and 10 minutes Star-Lord descends into the movie. Like, what the fuck are you doing here?
Don't threaten me with a good time. The idea of if we're talking the Star-Lord that was in EMH, that would end up making more sense. And I'm only saying that because the voice of Star-Lord in that was Master Chief.
But yes, not only is Brave Bang Braver just a fantastic show, it really does showcase what kind of director Obari was in the best way possible.
I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what a parody is when it comes to parody. You'll notice that the best kind of parodies are done by people who have a strong love for the source material
Yeah.
and are just having some fun with it. Gintama is a very sometimes brutal parody of shonen, but it is also just as sincere about shonen. I mean, it'll take the piss out of its colleagues on multiple occasions. And I do remember one episode of the anime that it was so stuffed of references that the translation had to add a 3-minute segment at the end of the episode just to track every single one of them.
Yeah, we've been over that a few times, but it's great.
In this particular case, you can't really parody it without being a fan.
And again, I mean, who better to parody Obari than Obari himself?
There seems to be a level of self-parodying or self-deprecating humor that is within the manga and anime production space, because you've seen this and we've talked about this, how certain mangaka depict themselves as animals or other things for reasons nobody knows, and they will not explain why. Arikawa, the creator of Full Metal Alchemist, keeps portraying herself as a cow. She has refused to explain why. She's hinted at the reason for it is because she grew up on a dairy farm, which probably makes Edward Elric's hatred of milk a bit of an in-joke. Then you have Gintama's director depicting himself as a monkey. Naoko Takeuchi depicting her editor as a cat.
And the eternally bizarre Nabashin depicting himself as himself.
You know, there's a small part of me that thinks there was a missed opportunity to do a Japanese version of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas starring him. It doesn't even have to involve drugs. Just have him be on camera and be himself. I would watch the shit out of that. I'm trying to recall if he ever put out like an art book of just his stuff, because most of the stuff that he's been involved with has in some form had some degree of art book, depending on how big it was.
He has Robot Soul and Obarism, and Super Design Works First Mission under the bibliography.
I do find it funny that the reason he got into animation was because he was friends with Satoshi Urushihara in high school.
Just happened to be sitting next to him one day.
Another person who has a very noticeable style, but a good amount of it we can't talk about without getting in trouble.
What was it? The King of Boobs?
Yeah. I was wondering on his Twitter he would retweet a lot of stuff from New Japan Pro Wrestling. And then I ended up finding out that his little brother, Takami, between 2020 to 2023, was the president and CEO of New Japan.
Oh yeah, that came up when we were talking about it after one of the shows last time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I found the greatest artwork that he posted to promote New Japan.
Yeah. And of course, it involves your boy Great Okan.
The Mecha God Okan. I'm gonna have to insert that image in this episode because it is glorious.
I guess it could have been worse. He could have tried to depict Minoru Suzuki in mecha form, which is an absolutely terrifying thought. When it comes to him, it's one of those questions about what is the bigger impact, being a director as a certain storytelling style or a visual style. And I don't think there's ever going to be a straight answer to that.
Like, at the end of the day, I still think his legacy is more going to be that visual style.
Especially given how many people call back to it.
Oh, yeah. I don't even know if all of them always realize they're calling back to Obari. just because so much of it is so fundamental now.
And I think going forward, as far as him directing a full on TV anime, I don't see that happening for quite a while because keep in mind before this he hadn't done a full TV anime since 2013.
13.
I know there's some credits in between them, but those are for things like shorter animations. And in fact, you remember how we covered that short compilation that a bunch of different directors did?
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up working on something like that. It would certainly be interesting. And there's been plenty of television credits aside from that. It's usually been as designers or as doing opening sequence.
I think these days he's going to be kind of in that same boat where Nabashin is, where he's kind of happy doing what he does. Like Nabashin with his occasional episode directing, and Obari just continuing to make designs for people.
Meanwhile, plenty of other people are making anime that feel like works that he would do, and he'll have to correct people saying, "No, I didn't do that."
But yeah, so any overall thoughts to close us out?
I think we deserve credit for going through this whole thing without mentioning some of the more explicit stuff he's worked on.
I will also say it is kind of funny, like the weird mix of stuff this guy is going to be known for is how his designs have affected mecha, magical girl anime. It's weird how often his stuff shows up in magical girl anime and fighting games. Or at least the adaptations of fighting games.
Keep in mind, the thing that was his coming out party was his work with Fatal Fury. And anytime Terry Bogard shows up, he's not going to be far behind. Especially with the fucking comeback on a fucking tear that the King of Fighters has been on in the last few years. It's almost as if them getting out of the pachinko business was the best business decision they ever did.
Also, funnily enough, Obari did work on King of Fighters 15.
He also did a full short animation for that to help promote it. He's not going to be turning up his nose at his roots. If I ever got to sit down with him for 5 minutes, I'd ask him, "So what was it like? What was it like voicing a character in an anime you worked on,
Who did he voice?
or a video game, I should say?" Because of course I have to bring up Go Kaiser. But I think that is about as much as we could say on the matter. I know this was a short, a bit scattershot one, but because of where his influence has been, it's not one where we can really go through the timeline of events as easily, because the timeline of events is all over the place. It's not a timeline, it's a tumbleweed.
Yeah, so with that said, we bring this latest adventure to an end. You'll be able to catch us back here next month, which, if I remember right, we're going to be building a horror anime for October.
Yeah,